Hello and welcome to A Bit of a Boost with me, George Anderson. I'm a wellbeing and performance coach, speaker and author, and this podcast brings together guest experts, inspirational stories, and ideas that I think will give you a bit of a boost. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show one of my favourite guests, David Robson, who previously joined me back in February last year after I'd read his book, The Expectation Effect. Well, I just finished reading his latest book, and I think you're going to find our conversation today both interesting and informative. The book is called The Laws of Connection, and it really is a playbook for how we can build deeper and more meaningful relationships with the people around us, and also some of the more unexpected benefits from doing so. David also unpacks some of the research that shows how we may be better at socializing than we might think, talking about phenomena such as the liking gap. Of course, I highly recommend that you read the book itself, which is published this week. But in this podcast, we get into several of the 13 strategies that he talks about in the book and learn many new things. For example, how asking for help can benefit not just you, but also the person that you're asking. How to express gratitude and pay compliments effectively, and also how to receive compliments. And why a strong social network even improves your ability to fight off illness. I think you're going to enjoy this one, so get ready for a bit of a boost. Hey Dave, welcome back to A Bit of a Boost. How you doing?
Yeah, really good, thanks. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be chatting to you again.
I really enjoyed our conversation last time when you were on the show talking about your book, The Expectation Effect, which I still reference and read excerpts from to this very day. And you have another book coming out very soon, this week in fact, called The Laws of Connection, which I've had the pleasure of reading as well. And I'm delighted for the opportunity to get a little bit deeper into that. How has it been since you finished writing the book and getting so close to publication? How are you feeling about everything?
Pretty chilled this time, actually. Like, I think the anxiety has kind of, been less salient with each book, actually. So with my first book, The Intelligence Trap, I kind of really freaked out, worrying about what the reviews would be like, and now I'm much more sanguine. I'm really lucky to have a supportive publisher, and I really believe strongly in the message of the book. So yeah, I'm just excited to hear what people think.
Interesting, actually, that you mentioned about having supportive people around you, in particular your publisher, because that really does strike at the heart of what we're talking about today, which is connection and the way we can support others around us as well is a big part of that. And when I saw the title, the Laws of Connection, I love something where you can sort of break it down and say, well, there's a number of there's a framework here. There's laws, we can follow these and we can do things to get better at stuff. But just to start off with, why is this important? When we talk about connection, human to human connection, we know that it's there, we know that it's important, but we might have thousands of followers on social media. But why is real connection so important?
Yeah, so I think you raise a really important point there by talking about, people who have huge kind of online social networks. Because the research shows it's not just about quantity, it's also about quality of connection. So, we've known this right back to the 1960s that our sense of connection with the people around us can determine how long we live. Our chances of dying of diseases like heart attacks or strokes. It's even determines like things like whether you are more or less likely to get diabetes, whether you're more or less likely to get Alzheimer's, how quickly you recover from the common cold. So it's really, or indeed, if you're even infected by the common cold. So it's fundamental actually for our health. And over the last few decades, scientists have really unpicked the physiological mechanisms behind that. So it's all very good, solid science. And so I think it's well accepted by scientists. I think it's less appreciated by the general public. At least the size of the effects is less well known. So when people are asked to kind of order the kind of factors that will influence their health, lots of people put social connection kind of near the bottom of the list. Actually, it's right there at the top. It's, when you look at the effect sizes in all of these studies, hundreds of studies, you can see that social connection is there alongside exercise and diet. So it's really fundamental for living a good life.
Yeah, and that's incredible when you put it like that, and you compare it against other things that we know. Obviously, exercising well and eating well, and I think even smoking was quite was behind the influence of social connection, wasn't it? So we
Yeah.
kind of know intuitively, well, all those things are important for our health, but yeah, we maybe devalue social connection. Do you think that's because there's so much variety with how we might define social connection? We just talked there about masses of followers on social media or being online a lot, having lots of so-called friends.
Yeah.
But is it really the depth that we need to be drilling into here to really give us these health and longevity benefits?
So I would say it's a combination of both. I mean, there's definitely a benefit to having lots of weak ties. I would say if you have hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram, those are weaker than weak ties. Like I don't think just getting thousands of likes on a post is really what we're talking about here. But actually, just having like good, weak connections with members of your community. Having a big kind of wide social network that's quite superficial can be beneficial. But I think really, we also mustn't neglect the those really core friendships where you feel fully supported by the people around you and you feel that they truly understand you. Because we can know lots of people who, you know, lots of famous people, even like people like Keira Knightley or Lizzo, have talked about this, where they can feel very lonely even though they're surrounded by lots of admirers. So it's really feeling that you're understood, that other people are on your wavelength, that's so important. But I also think it's kind of neglected partly because people don't really know what to do about this. It's all very well knowing that social connection is important, but if you're feeling lonely and you're shy, you're struggling to find that connection. We haven't really had any practical advice for how to go about changing that, beyond like join a club or some kind of very superficial advice like that. So that's what I was really trying to target with my book. Actually, was showing that over the last 10 years we've had an explosion of research that's really got to grips with the psychological barriers that prevent us from connecting. So the reasons that even if we are surrounded by other people, we might not feel understood, and then how to overcome them. So now I think this is, in much the same way that we can give dietary advice or we can plan workouts for people depending on their needs. We can also give very specific guidelines for people who maybe feel a bit lonely and really crave closer relationships.
Yeah, I was just going to say actually until now, because now we have
Right.
with the
Yeah.
laws of connection a playbook really for making progress, and we'll get into a ton of the detail of the book and some of the practical takeaways from it as well. But you talk about the personality myth in the book, and this idea that I'm just not a very outgoing person. That belief that that's how I am, and I will always be like that, or
Yeah.
people don't like me. I'm not very good in social situations. And of course, these are all learnable skills, which is, I think, quite liberating and empowering for a lot of people, but maybe also quite scary as well to look at, well, I've got to go out there and I've got to maybe fail and experiment and make myself vulnerable again. Just before we move on to the first one, actually, it makes me think as well of a conference I was at recently, the World Happiness Summit, the WOHASU in London. And they had the US Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, was there. And he was talking about one of the major drivers in US health policy at the moment is around addressing the huge impact of loneliness in the US population, and in not just in the elderly, but in children as well.
Yeah.
Children feeling very isolated, and I think across all demographics. So this is clearly something that isn't just buried in the arcane research and you've picked out some weird studies. This is something that's just huge and is being taken very seriously at the highest levels of government, certainly in the US anyway. Um, if we've got sort of loneliness and a sense of disconnection at one end of the spectrum, at the other end, we've got this. I'd like to think that we've all had that experience of meeting someone that we just click with really, really rapidly, and maybe find it difficult to truly define and understand why and how that's happened. But it turns out there are various reasons for that clicking, and maybe giving us some power to click more readily and rapidly, build better rapport with people as well. So tell us a little bit about the idea of this shared reality that you write about in the book and some of the other elements that go into that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is a very old idea that the very best relationships are those where we feel that we've got this kind of merged mind. So writers like Montaigne, from the from 500 or more years ago, were writing about this idea that your kind of souls are yoked to one another,
Mm,
and that you feel that you know exactly what the other person is thinking and feeling, and vice versa. You can predict what their actions will be, and that's what the current research is looking at. So there's lots of psychological research that which you give people kind of surveys, and you ask them, how often do you feel that you're kind of finishing each other's sentences, or that you instantly have the same emotional reaction to an event. And that is really important for predicting how close people feel to each other, their commitment in relationships, all of these important factors. And what I think is really crucial there to understand, and which we often neglect, is the fact that this is true even when there are other demographic differences that you might think would separate people. So this isn't just about being of the same age as someone, or coming from the same hometown, or being of the same sexuality or the same race. People with very different backgrounds can click instantly because their minds are somehow attuned to each other. I think the problem here is that we often, when we neglect that fact, when we're kind of going on online dating, for example, we have very fixed ideas of like who we think we're going to click with,
mm,
but those factors just don't matter as much as the kind of chemistry you have with someone, and you can only discover that chemistry if you meet them and give them a chance. So we should be maybe a little bit less discriminating before meeting people, and just see where the conversation takes us. But then I believe so strongly in this research because it's also been shown neurologically that our minds are attuned. So you can do brain scans of people, and their responses to different video clips, so to a music video or a comedy routine or a documentary, and you can see that you can actually predict how who's going to be friends and who
wow.
are not going to be friends by the brain responses, because the closer people are, the more likely it is that their brain activity is kind of synchronized and coupled, so they show the same responses at the same times to these events. So we talk of this it's a metaphor that our minds have merged, but there's this kind of neurological reality to that as well.
And what are some of the things that we can do to not necessarily find our deepest soulmate in every social interaction that we have, but to build faster levels of rapport? And I'm thinking in particular in, say, a networking situation where it might feel a little bit forced, and the whole point is to build out your network and to meet people and to get to know people. I know I get a little bit uncomfortable in those situations, I have to confess, and I know many people who I work with also do, and actually maybe have a little bit of social anxiety around that as well. What are some of the reasons why we maybe have a lower expectations of how people will see us and respond to us? But also, what are some of the tips and tools that we can be applying, and maybe mental approaches, some of the laws to help us
Right.
to build those better connections?
Yeah, so I think like the research, shows very robustly that we are overly pessimistic about those kinds of events. So you're not alone if you feel shy and a bit awkward at networking events, because on average most people do, and it's very natural. You're meeting someone who you know nothing about, and then uh, you're having to feel your way through the conversation to work out what are your common points of interest, what are the points of view that you share. Now, I find this research hardening because you'll ask people before those kinds of conversations to predict how awkward am I going to feel, how much am I going to like the other person. Um, and then you question them afterwards. And it's almost always better than what people expect. Is on average, you're gonna you're gonna find it easier. Like your fears have been unfounded. Like the conversation's going to go fairly smoothly. You're probably going to be interested in the other person. They're going to be interested in you. So we can all afford to be a bit braver. Now, the problem is that even if the conversation goes well, we often come away from it with a kind of anxiety that we didn't perform at our best. So we might really like the other person, but we assume that they didn't like us as much as we liked them. And you, again, in these experiments, you can do this by surveying both people in the conversation. Each person goes away thinking the same thing, that they liked the other person, but the other person didn't like them as much. That's called the liking gap. And it was really fundamental for me when writing this book, actually. It really inspired me to look into this because I really think that's a huge barrier to connection. If we go away with this kind of anxiety that the other person didn't like us as much, we're less likely to kind of build on that instant rapport that we had, to send a follow up email or to invite them to collaborate at work. So it's something that we do have to be aware of and kind of fight against. So that's one of my laws, is to trust that other people like you as much as you like them. Now we still have to be sensitive. We can't presume too much. So I think especially in dating, for example, like don't just assume that like everyone's going to fall head over heels in love with you on your first date. But you can just but also don't assume that, like, don't be too negative and defeatist and assume that they didn't like you, from when you have no real evidence for that. And don't be too forceful, but just like suggesting that you meet someone again. Underlining, I think this is really important in conversation, since we're both feeling the liking gap. Like, I just think at the end of a conversation, just like telling the other person, I really enjoyed this conversation, like making that
Yeah.
explicit can be incredibly helpful for reassuring those doubts, and making each party feel that they're comfortable and willing to build on that connection.
And that, of course, that's not the only assumption that we can fall foul of when it comes to building connections. And um, you talk about a few others as well, these biases that we perhaps have and these beliefs, and some of it linked around what you term. And I know this isn't your terminology, because you're drawing on. I think it was something like 300 different papers that you drew on for the research for this book. It's a
Yeah.
phenomenal amount of research. We talk about egocentric thinking, and this almost belief that we believe that other people are thinking in the same way as us. And I think that links into something which I've talked about a lot, and I know you reference in the book as well, which is around mind reading
Yeah.
and assuming that people know what we're thinking or feeling. And there was a beautiful personal example from you in the book as well, which is around where you maybe feel a little bit miffed that somebody hasn't picked up on how you're feeling and your emotional response, and why haven't they met those concerns and reached out to you or done something to assuage that. And if then the belief also, I know you, and the reason I'm kind of drilling into this is because this is how I feel often as well. If you were to spell it out, I'm feeling like this, it somehow devalues the support that might then come. Um, and but it's madness, though, isn't it, to expect to assume that people just know how we're feeling because of what's going on inside, especially if we're sort of masking how we're projecting those emotions. So, tell me a little bit more about some of the research behind all of this, and maybe a little bit more about egocentric thinking in general.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of, I find it ironic. So we assume that other people don't like us as much as they really do. But then also we kind of think we're totally transparent, so people um, can see what we're feeling. And then if they don't respond, we it's kind of jarring. It kind of underlines the fact for us that maybe we don't have that shared reality that we so crave. Now, this builds on a lot of research on theory of mind, which is just the fact that humans, neurotypical humans, are capable of kind of putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and trying to take their perspective. So we can kind of guess whether they know the same things that we do or don't know the same things that we do. So we are capable of doing that, but it requires kind of a bit of effort, a bit of cognitive effort. And so often we get lazy and we just forget to kind of take that extra step of taking that perspective, and instead just we just assume that like everyone's thinking the same way as us. So you can see this in laboratory experiments where you're kind of asking for people to reach for objects, some of which are obscure to the other person, and we don't really take into account the fact that there might be like a screen in front of this object that we're looking at. We just assume, but the other person can't see. We just assume that they can see the same things that we do. Uh, and then I think it's really evident often when people say these kind of quite edgy political opinions and they assume that everyone else agrees with them without realizing there could be a diversity of opinion. I mean, my favorite experiment looking at this uh, observed this illusion of understanding that you often have with people speaking completely different languages who don't share a common tongue. So you had Chinese speakers, like Chinese Mandarin speakers, who were kind of describing their describing certain kind of concepts, and then with like multiple choice answers for to uh, kind of label what they were saying. And they were speaking, in their own language, Mandarin, and then English speakers had to kind of pick from the multiple choice answers. What was it about? Even though they couldn't speak Chinese Mandarin. And the fact is that both the people speaking, both the Chinese participants and the American English participants, overestimated how good they were at this task. So the people speaking Chinese thought that if they were doing it very slowly and clearly, that the Americans would be able to understand the words. And the Americans assumed that they were somehow getting a hint of what was being said, even though they didn't understand a single word of the language. I find that hilarious, but I think, as Brits, it's quite common for us to see like our compatriots abroad kind of talking very loudly and slowly to people, expecting to be served the food that they want, and then they're surprised when they don't get it. So, I think we've all had experiences of that, but I really think that illustrates this kind of illusion of understanding that we have, that we think that other people, we think if something's obvious in our mind, we assume it is for the other person too. And we want to be conscious of that. And we need to check those assumptions often just by asking a simple question, like,
Yeah.
in everyday life, like, you know, do you know that? Do you realize this? I've been thinking this. Do you agree? Rather than just making the assumptions. Because when we do that, we avoid the sense that we avoid those awkward moments when actually it's obvious that um, you're both talking at cross purposes, which can really break the sense of shared reality.
Yeah, I was going to ask there, like, what is the solution to this? And of course, you just outlined it there, just to be explicit, a bit like finishing a conversation that you've enjoyed and being aware of the liking gap and maybe the assumption from the other person to go away thinking that, well, they didn't like me very much, or I didn't make a very good
Yeah.
first impression there, and be explicit, like, I've really enjoyed talking to you and I've really appreciated this conversation. And it didn't take much to do that, but
Right.
it clears up a lot of the a lot of these biases and that the other person might be experiencing. A lot of what you've described so far really is, I'd sort of put into the bucket of empathy, understanding, relationship management, and even sort of higher up from that, emotional intelligence, and having this awareness of ourself and the other person as well. How much does the research that you've been doing and some of the takeaways, the laws, feed into that broader understanding of emotional intelligence, the importance of developing that, not just for our own well-being, but to get more done and to forge these better relationships?
Right. Yeah. I mean, we know that kind of social skills are really important, and it often like really bothers me when people talk about them as soft skills, because
Mm.
I think that's just underappreciating what they really do. these soft skills are actually fundamentally important for our success in the workplace. If you're even if you're not managing a team, if you're really unable to kind of communicate what you need from your colleagues to complete a project and to get them on board, um, and to make them feel valued for their contributions and to motivate them, then you're going to really struggle to progress in your career. So, they are fundamentally important. I think emotional intelligence, there's a lot has been written about that, some of which has been criticized because often it does just almost appeals to kind of social and cultural norms without appreciating that there are, you know, a huge range of valid responses to any particular event. So I think in a lot of the tests of emotional intelligence, actually, like they've been criticized because they're maybe not really appreciating, uh, how important context is for
Mm.
reading what someone else is doing and for determining your reaction in return. And so that's what I think with the laws of connection. I'm really trying to equip people with greater flexibility with their social skills to kind of that could be applied in any situation.
Yeah. And actually, you mentioned about appreciation there. I know you're talking about appreciation for them not being called soft skills because they are so
Yeah.
fundamental to how we navigate our way through life successfully, and what that means to our experience of that as well. But actually, appreciation is one of the laws that you outline as well, and just being able to appreciate or to be grateful for another person is hugely potent as a technique for building those relationships and those deeper connections. And of course, many people, I've talked about gratitude here on this podcast before, and I teach it in many of my courses and programs and workshops and speeches. Um, but it's often billed as being something that you just do quietly by yourself at the end of the day. Think about three good things that you're grateful for. And there can be tremendous benefits to doing that, from giving you a bit of an uplift in your own sense of positive emotions to giving you a better perspective, a more accurate perspective on how things are in your life. But what you talk about in the book is sharing those gratitudes with other people. And there was one particular study that jumped out at me, which was with I forget the name of the company now, but there was I think employees were given the option of a $25, the equivalent of a $25 reward for some extra work that they'd done, or a note of thanks from their line manager.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll ask you to describe that research a little bit more, because it's just it so beautifully speaks to this power of a well chosen and well timed appreciation of somebody doing something well or going above and beyond, which is so often ignored or missed, I think, in the workplace in particular. So tell us a little bit about that research and the broader context of appreciation and gratitude.
Yeah, so I think this was, I can't remember if it was IBM, but it was certainly like a computer making kind of
Yeah.
processing chips for computers. And they just tested out different kinds of rewards. So there was, a monetary reward for having high productivity one week, or you could have a note of appreciation from the boss just saying, like, we recognize that you worked extra hard, and, we value that. And, like both kind of proved to be motivating. So, you know, companies could save a lot of money just by being a bit more appreciative. But I think what was important with the kind of thank you notes was that actually they uh, the people continued to feel motivated even
Mm.
after they'd received it. Whereas with the financial reward, you were like, okay, I've achieved that, I've got my payout, and then people's kind of productivity returned to the baseline. Whereas for the thank you notes, it had a longer term benefit. Now I think we have to be careful with this because, um, like I've had bosses in the past who would kind of tell me at my like personal appraisal that they, loved what I was doing, that they really, that I was a valued member of the team, but I was also being paid like about 30% less than the other colleagues on the team. And like, eventually I had to say, like, if you really appreciate me, you have to bring me up to the same salary as the other people that I'm working with. So we can't just think that like kind words
Mm.
are enough for employees, because actually they have to pay their mortgage. Like,
Yeah.
they really have to, practically speaking, money is still very important. But I think but you can have both. Like, you can reward people financially. You can also show um, kind of daily appreciation for what they're doing. And, the two together will mean that, employees are far happier, far more productive, far less likely to leave their position, because, appreciation is one of the best predictors of kind of well-being in the workplace, satisfaction, and even your risk of burnout. If you feel appreciated, you're at less
Mm.
risk of burnout than someone who is not appreciated.
Yeah, and that very closely matches another conversation I had with Christina Maslach on the podcast a little while ago, who talks about burnout and engagement. And out of her 6 predictors of burnout and engagement, reward and recognition is one of them. And yeah, that is monetary compensation, but it is also recognition. And I think we've all probably had that experience as well. It's so intuitive that we know if we've done a good job, if we've pulled out all the stops, we've gone above and beyond, and nobody's even mentioned it, nobody's even noticed or recognized it, it's actually can be very demotivating, let alone it
Yeah.
being a motivator. If somebody doesn't notice that, or at least mention it, then it's very demotivating. And actually they probably do notice it, and it's that gap, isn't it, between somebody noticing it and then actually taking the time to mention it, that's the bit that's so often missed, because we move on to
Right.
the next goal, the next project, the next deadline, the next quarterly target. And I know everything that's gone on in the previous month or quarter is kind of forgotten. We've got to rush to the next one. So this
Right.
really is, I think, a key part of just motivation theory anyway. But for all of us, with the people around us, to be able to just recognize and to identify and to be appreciative of people who have been there for us and supported us, or are just doing a great job.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really goes back to the egocentric bias. Actually, often you find in these studies that you know when you ask people like, why do why are you not expressing gratitude to someone who means a lot to you?
Mm,
They just assume that the other person knows it,
must know
and
that.
then and then they think it's going to look ingratiating, or it's going to be awkward to kind of say thank you to their loved ones, because you know you're stating the obvious, but it's not true at all. The other person doesn't realize how their actions have changed your life and improved your life for the better, and just articulating that can be incredibly meaningful to them. No, I would say we have to be a bit careful about the way that we express kind of compliments and gratitude. So, there's I think like you can't rely on positive stereotypes. You have to be sure that you're actually conveying respect with what you do. So wolf whistling at someone you find attractive is not really conveying respect. You're just objectifying them. So that is not the kind of compliment that I'm talking about here. It's also better for you to really pin down the quality that you appreciate in the person, rather than talking more generally
Mm,
about uh, kind of your gratitude, or how their actions have affected you. So if I were to, have asked a colleague for help with a creative problem, and then they kind of found a solution for me or provided some inspiration, my gratitude could be expressed by me saying, "Oh wow, thanks so much. That really got me out of this mess. Like, my life is so much easier now." It's fine, better than nothing, but you're much better to say, like, thanks so much. Your creativity, like your original thinking, really helped me there. I
yeah.
really appreciate how you're always on hand to give me support, because you're helping that other person be seen, and you're actually showing that it's not just the action that mattered, but it's the person behind the action. So those kinds of compliments tend to be much more effective.
Yeah, and I think I've had a conversation similar to this with another guest on the podcast previously, who talked about strengths spotting in other
Mm.
people. So you see somebody doing something, well, they may not even have directly impacted you, but actually to pay a compliment that is linked into something that they're doing really well, a character strength in particular, is especially if that person is aware that that's something that they do well, but can't really put the finger on what is, or even if it's noticed in people
Mm.
around them, for you to be able to identify that and then communicate that, it's incredibly powerful as a not just a tool to deepen that connection between you and that person, but to really benefit them as well as an individual, because they
Yeah.
recognize it as something that they're actually, I'm quite good at that, and kind of gives you a good, what, maybe not just a warm fuzzy feeling, but maybe the encouragement to do more of whatever it is that they've been doing.
Exactly.
When it comes to, there's a dark side to this as well, and which is that we can abuse the power that we have as a complimenter, as somebody who's bestowing lots of positive words and thoughts on another person to maybe get something out. So we have our own agenda. And maybe there's more cynical people listening would be, I know people who are like that, and anybody who's paying me a compliment must be after something.
Yeah.
How do we both deliver a compliment in a way? I guess it's what you just said there. Be specific about the quality.
Mm.
But is there anything else that we need to be maybe mindful or cautious of? And when we're receiving compliments, what's the best way of receiving those compliments? Because I think the tendency for so many is to dismiss it and to rebuff it and to belittle, it's no big deal, or you should see this, or yes but, and we
Yeah.
erase that compliment power because of something else that's maybe even unrelated. So how do we
Yeah.
give good compliments and feedback, and how do we receive them as well?
Yeah. So I think giving good compliments, I think, it really is like kind of being specific, being realistic. Also, like, it's really insulting actually when you know that you're being patronized,
Mm,
and that feels like you're being manipulated. So if you know, just don't exaggerate what you what you're saying to the other person, but just like make sure that you're being honest in what you think. And I think I would say in general, like people do really enjoy receiving compliments, and they're not nearly as cynical as we would imagine they would be. But if you are just trying to flatter people for manipulation, like they're going to find out very quickly. I just can't I can't condone that at all, that kind of manipulation. So I try to be quite careful in the book to say that it's like, maybe you could try to use these laws in a very Machiavellian way, but I just don't think it's a good idea because
yeah,
it's unethical, and you're probably going to be found out, and then you're going to lose that sense of connection with the people around you. They're not going to benefit, you're not going to benefit. Eventually you're going to be kind of feel alienated from them. So just don't do it. But the good thing is that I don't think most people do have like malintent, and I think most people kind of recognize your compliments for what they are. Now, in
yeah,
terms of receiving compliments, I have to say, I've never really understood. Although I think it's a question maybe of personality and shyness. And even though I am quite shy, I've just always loved receiving compliments. Like I've never felt embarrassed or resented a compliment in my life. Like I always just like it was a joke at university because I just like you know absolutely like take it as a gift. And so I guess like I would say see it as a gift from someone, and
mm,
don't try to like reject or undermine what they're saying. Just accept it as what it is, an act of kindness, and be grateful for it.
yeah. No, I love that. It's such a knee jerk reaction for so many of us, I think, to
Mm,
bat away compliments or even qualities that have been identified within us.
yeah.
One of the things I've found to be quite useful in my experience for getting feedback, and it's say positive feedback, often that feedback will be quite general, and the praise may be quite general, like, oh, I did a really good job with that. And what I've found is just asking some more deeper searching questions like, well, was there anything specific that
Mm,
resonated with you? Or was there anything that what did you do with that
yeah.
information, with that idea, with that feeling that you had as a result of it? Because I find that not only helps me to really understand the specifics, but it might also help the individual as well who's kind of given me a compliment to to really reflect on actually, what was it specifically? Because often we just get a general sense of something being good or something doing a good job, but then don't always think about the details and the specifics. So
Right. Yeah.
that's been my experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, I've experienced that a lot with my writing. And that like overly general praise is as bad as overly general criticism. And that it's not really helping you to learn what you can
Yeah.
repeat again, or what not to repeat again. So yeah, whatever feedback we're giving, I think we have to be very precise, in what we're describing. And when it comes to negative feedback, I think that actually makes it less hurtful. If you can say, rather than just like rubbishing what someone's done, if you can
Mm.
say, here's something actionable that you could do to improve it, it's just so much more constructive.
Oh yeah, 100%. And again, it goes back to commenting on somebody's behavior or actions or performance rather than them as an individual.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
our ego tends to get up in arms if we feel like we're being attacked. Our personality or our self is being attacked,
Right.
and so we're less likely to take that feedback on board. Whereas if somebody's saying
Yeah.
you did this and that didn't connect with me, but if you did it this way, that might have a more of an impact in getting that message across. So I'm thinking of somebody presenting in this particular instance. But anything we do, I think the general rule of thumb is that we can focus on the performance rather than the person. Is usually easier to accept, and it's still a gift. It's still something that they can choose to do something with or not. But it's probably easier to do something with it than if someone feels that they are being attacked personally.
Yeah.
And all of which is a part of building those relationships and connections as well. If somebody feels that they're able to give you feedback, then there's an element of vulnerability on their part and your part as an individual as well. And I think that vulnerability
Yeah.
is an essential component of building relationships, and it sort of runs as a thread throughout the book there. And a lot of the laws will reflect on that. And I think you talk about your own personal experience as well. And since researching the book, you've managed to sort of put some of the laws into practice
Right.
yourself as well. I mean, tell us a little
Yeah.
about your own sort of drive for writing this book in the first place, Dave, and some of your experiences of things that you've benefit from since doing this research.
Yeah, I mean, like with my other books, it's it's all based on, robust scientific evidence, but then I also try to kind of check if it's practical. So I wouldn't write about something that I couldn't put into practice myself. With this book, definitely, I think each of the laws, taught me something personally about how to uh, deal with the people around me. The egocentric thinking was definitely one of them. So, you know, as we were discussing, like just recognizing that even if I think my emotions are really obvious, it doesn't mean that the other person will see that. So sometimes you do have to, fully articulate what you're feeling, because their interpretation otherwise could be totally different from my interpretation. And clarifying, what other people are feeling by asking questions rather than making assumptions. Uh, I also think one of the things that I recognized in myself was that I wasn't always um, a fully supportive friend, and that sometimes I might fall into this category known as ambivalent relationships. And so that is when, through carelessness, often you're just not kind of consistent in your kindness to the other person. And, in my case, sometimes frenemies can be like very nice and then very nasty. So, like very insulting. Um, the kind of person who you don't know if they're gonna kind of act like your best friend or then criticize you very bluntly if they're in a bad mood. I'm not like that, but I think also I don't always show well how much people mean to me. Again, it's like not expressing enough gratitude. I'm quite forgetful with things like birthdays. I often turn up late to meetings, which I think conveys a lack of respect for the other person. I often let other people get in touch with me to meet up rather than me making the first move, which might look like I don't really care enough about the relationship
Yeah.
to kind of make the effort. And so yeah, it's I think like just making sure that I'm very consistent and I try to fully convey how much people mean to me at all times. I think that's been very
Yeah.
important because what the research shows is that these ambivalent relationships often like they can be more hurtful than people who are just purely aversive. Because if someone's just like pretty unkind and critical whenever you meet them, you just learn to like not take
You
any
know what you're getting.
notice. But right, exactly. But frenemies kind of, by definition, they're people who are important to us, and then it hurts even more when they don't live up to
Yeah.
our expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think all of this really points to in the direction that this is stuff that we can apply, not just practically, but if we don't feel like we're very good at something like making friends or being good in social situations, or just the guilt that sometimes we feel if we don't feel like we're being a good enough friend. There are things that we can do. And actually, I think a part of it as well, again, that vulnerability comes in where we are identifying, like, where are my shortcomings? And not
Right.
judging ourselves for that, but just being quite objective about it and saying, well, what can I do about it? What would improvement look like? How could I start to make progress here? And the book outlines a number of different strategies to help you do that. There's one more law. I mean, there are 13 laws in the book, and we haven't gone through all of them in turn. Of course, we haven't, but obviously recommend everybody just buy the book and read the book. But there's another sort of strategy or law that you talk about, which is absolutely fascinating, which is asking for help or
Mm.
asking for a favor, and the impact that that can have, and some of the reasons why we are maybe a little reluctant to do it more often. Tell us a little bit about that, and if you don't mind, and how we can start to use that in an authentic and beneficial way.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real problem. And again, I think it comes from this kind of shyness that a lot
Mm,
of people share, which is we feel quite awkward asking for asking for help. We think we're going to inconvenience other people, that they're going to judge us badly if we are kind of showing vulnerability. I'm definitely one of these people who had always tried to do, things for myself rather than leaning on the people around me. And again, the research shows, we're just overly pessimistic. That in general, people are much more likely to help you than you think. That includes strangers, even when you're asking for something like for someone to give you directions or even take you to the place that you're looking for, uh, you know, around a street corner, or kind of if your phone's run out of battery, asking to borrow someone else's phone to make an important call. People tended to assume they would have to ask. The participants assumed that they would have to ask about twice as many people to get what they wanted as they actually did in real life. So people are more generous than you'd think.
mm,
But uh, but we mustn't abuse that. So obviously, you have to give people. You have to recognize that people have lots of different things going on in their lives, and your request can't just be another burden for them. So I think it's always useful to kind of make that obvious, and then to show your gratitude afterwards. So what the research shows is that actually, when people act generously, it's really good for their kind of well-being in the moment, and actually it can have long-term effects. If people are generous, they tend to experience less stress overall in their lives, and that can have knock-on effects for their health. But that's only true if they really think that their actions are making a difference.
yeah.
And if you never express gratitude to the other person and
I
never
don't know.
kind of show them how much they've helped you, they're not getting that benefit. Um, and then, but it's not just about kind of well-being and happiness. Asking for help from people can actually be a really good way of cementing your friendship. So there's a lot of research from America and Japan on this phenomenon known as the Benjamin Franklin effect, which is just this idea that even if you don't really get on with someone, actually asking them for some kind of support in some way can actually increase their regard for you. And I think that comes from the fact that you're kind of showing your respect for that person and asking for their
Mm.
help. You're showing that you trust them. You're kind of conveying that you consider them to be a good person, and it just makes them feel like this is a relationship that really matters to them. And I think you can see that in your personal relationships. Often, if you hear that your friend asked someone else for advice on a matter that's really within your expertise, it can actually be quite
Mm.
insulting because you think, well, why? What is it about our friendship that meant you didn't feel like you could call on me when you needed me?
Yeah.
And the research really supports that. So actually, you know, with all like considering like good manners and like all of the things I've just described, we shouldn't be as scared to ask for help when we need it as we currently are, because actually it can be a very effective way of building connection um, in a way that we just wouldn't have expected.
Yeah, and again, there's an element of vulnerability as well. It's like I need
Right.
help, and I'm willing to express that and to demonstrate it. And you're somebody I've identified that can help me. And it might be confiding in somebody, it might be asking for a favor, helping with a task. And I think you're right. It's very easy to not just um, undervalue the impact that can have on the other person, but there's almost a reluctance within us to ask people for help because we're assuming that they're going to say no or deny us, and then we're going to be left vulnerable. And
Yeah.
if we reflect that back on ourselves, most of us would probably, if the shoe was on the other foot, be more than happy to, and in fact, be
Yeah.
delighted to help somebody with a similar weighted request, as was evidenced in the research. And I think I read the study that you outlined in the book about asking for directions to a destination that was a few
Yeah.
blocks away, so a few minutes out of of an inconvenience to the stranger, and one in every two people acquiesced to that request and
Yeah.
took that person with them to this destination. Whereas they, I think, estimated that only 1 in 7, they'd have to ask 7 people before they found someone who'd be able to do that. So again, that egocentric thinking kicking in there, we underestimate how well received our requests for assistance will be.
Yeah.
Just kind of finishing off then, Dave, we talked about social media at the beginning of the conversation today, and this isn't just about connections and followers, it's about the depth of those connections. But does it really matter how we develop and build those connections? Does it in person hold that much more weight compared with something that is a little bit more online and message based?
Yeah, I mean, so there's definitely an advantage to face-to-face meetings and then video calls compared to a phone call, and then a phone call compared to a message. Because I think each kind of each at each level down that chain, you're kind of losing some element of communication, whether
Mm.
it's kind of the warmth of someone's touch or the facial expressions, the tone of their voice. It really, you want to kind of have the full experience, if possible, of being present with someone. But having said that, I think we're overly pessimistic about this. So if you can't actually meet someone face to face, it doesn't mean that you should just like not bother to text them or call them, because actually those gestures are also really appreciated. And so there are these very good studies that have shown that actually people, you know, they they choose no connection at all over having some kind of imperfect way of connecting with someone. And that doesn't really make logical sense. Like, people really appreciate hearing from you however you do it. And also that's true for, long distance friendships, people who you might not have seen for years. Um, you know, just send that message. Try to rebuild the friendship. You'll probably be surprised by how grateful that other person will be to have heard from you. And you'll probably find that they were feeling exactly the same, that they wanted to rebuild the connection, but they just didn't know how to start. And you're taking
Yeah.
that first step.
That's not necessarily directly related to social media and digital connection, but what you just described there at the end is absolutely been my experience, where I've maybe lost touch with some of my friends over the years, and the assumption has been, well, they're busy, and then we've drifted
Yeah.
apart. And then when I have reached out to get back in touch with some people, have been obviously delighted to, well, I say obviously, they have been delighted to hear from me, and it's been wonderful to rekindle that. And they've just been just as bad as I've been in terms of keeping in touch, and it's just been one of those things. But again, I've found myself making those assumptions that, well, we've drifted apart because they're doing different things, and they're not interested in what we had previously. So reading the book was an incredible reminder and a practical guide, and there were so many bits that I found myself just nodding my head to and thinking, yep, I do that I'm subconsciously aware of, or have been, but never realized that it was a thing that other people do this too. We think it's just us, right, that does this and has these biases or makes these assumptions. And so it's incredibly, I think, quite a relief to see that, well, I'm not a weirdo completely anyway. In some respects, maybe I am, but that others are like this too. And there's something we can do. And there are real benefits to doing this, not just the long-term longevity, health benefits, but immediate benefits to our well-being, to our experience of life, and to many of the other advantages that come from having these deeper, more meaningful connections.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I think actually, like you're saying, it is a relief. And I hope that's what my book will give people, is this sense of relief that they're not alone in their feelings of, shyness or reserve amongst other people. And that actually it's a kind of common human experience. I actually find it quite ironic, really, that the thing that we um, the thing that we often share and which could connect us to other people is also our fear of being rejected by other people. Like everyone feels it, but we kind of think we're unique in that. And then, when we feel that we're kind of isolated, we start blaming ourselves. We think that we're uniquely bad at maintaining or forming friendships, and that only makes it more discouraging. And so I hope the book really just tells people that actually you're better at this than you think you are. Other people are better at it than they think they are. You can afford to be a little bit braver, because it's only if you kind of take those steps to reach out that you'll actually build that social life you really want.
Brilliant. Well, onwards to building better, more deeper connections as well. The book is out on June the 6th, and we'll get all of the links and to your website and everything else into the show notes. But David, thanks so much for joining me today. Thanks for writing the book, doing all the work that's gone into it. And I'm sure that it will be a tremendous success. So thank you once again.